And just a few words of background. My name is Bob Gulak, for those of you who don't know me. In 2006, I was elected as a reform candidate running outside the party line onto the Bergen County Democratic Committee, where I was much struck by certain practices, that candidates weren't allowed to speak to the convention before the elections, that Joe Ferriero would announce that he would alone count all the votes and we would have to trust him, that people trying to put their ballots in the so-called secret ballot box would be pressured to show the ballots to Ferriero's people. And if they refused, they would say, aren't you a county employee? Why aren't you showing me your vote? Okay. And I was also struck, I must say, at my first convention, to be threatened with violence by one of Ferriero's people. So it struck me that this was a very upsetting situation, and under the bylaws, we had the right to call a reform convention and pass resolutions reversing these practices. We put together such a call. It had the necessary support. Under the law, Ferriero had to call the convention. Ferriero violated the bylaws, violated our state law, so I'm now moving from things that are legal to things that are illegal, and did not hold the conventions. We went to Steve Rothman's office. We asked for him to make a public statement of support. He promised us that he would make a public statement that regardless of what the legal technicalities were, such a convention should definitely be held. He never fulfilled that promise. Okay. Then we came, having not had a reform convention, to the re-election of Joe Ferriero. Just prior to the re-election process in June, the Bergen Record came out with a series of investigative reports on Ferriero, detailing the things that became the basis for the indictments that followed in September. The subpoenas were out on these matters. The Bergen Record had given the relevant facts. It was clear that bad stuff was going on. Stephen Rothman endorsed Ferriero for re-election, calling him my close personal friend, and for sure. And Ferriero was re-elected. Now, Paul and I and the others at Bergen Grassroots sent out a letter to all the members of the committee. We said, think carefully before you re-elect this guy again. We know he has the endorsement of Governor Corzine and Steve Rothman. These are very popular people. But you're giving him a 2-year term. And under the bylaws, there is no way to force him out. There is no impeachment and removal process under the bylaws. He can resign anytime he wants out. There is a replacement provision to replace him if he goes. But it will be up to him. If you give him the job, you're giving it to him for 2 years, and you're not going to be asked for your opinion if he gets indicted. And we said in this letter, do you want to be campaigning for Barack Obama, waiting to hear what the grand jury thinks of Joseph Ferriero and Dennis Uri? Well, the Bergen County Democratic Committee followed the advice of Steve Rothman and not our advice. They re-elected Ferriero for a 2-year term. He was then fairly promptly indicted on exactly the facts that had already been on the public record, and which his lawyer does not deny. His lawyer simply says, these facts don't constitute a legal charge. But the facts that were in the paper when Rothman endorsed Ferriero for re-election are the facts that are uncontested today. Now, unfortunately, we were absolutely right. There is still no removal provision. So you'll see a lot of careless talk in the paper. Governor Corzine says, I want to participate in finding a replacement for Ferriero. There's reports of a meeting on November 17 of elected officials of the Democratic Party from Bergen County discussing who will replace Ferriero, discussing the fact that Ferriero has to be gone by the end of January. The question is, how is he going to be gone by the end of January? What mechanism do we have if he decides he wants to stay? The only politician who seems to be...
Or what promises will be made to Mr. Ferriero if it becomes necessary to persuade him to resign in order to let the process continue? The fact is, he can't. There's no way that he can be compelled to resign. And as
the bylaws now stand.
As the bylaws now stand. It can't happen. He must give his agreement. And this is a pretty savvy guy who's gotten very, very wealthy as a result of his political connections and his work his assignment as chair of the BCDO. And so one wonders, what will it take? What will be required? And I just want to also point again, this is a group of 1,100 men and women, 550 men and 550 women. They are supposed to make decisions for this committee. The so-called executive committee doesn't have the power to do the things that it has done thus far. There is no, you can read it's not a very complicated document. You can read the bylaws from one end to the other. It's 21 pages. And you won't find anything that supports the actions that are now taken.
Okay, I'll get to those actions of September 15th in a second. I just want to say, in closing out, what is the reality of New Jersey politics here? One person appears to understand it, and it's a guy named Joseph Arian, who was asked recently, do you want to take Ferriero's place? And he responded, there's no vacancy. When there's a vacancy, ask me again. And reporters reported this as saying, Arian not interested, we will soon have a new chairperson. That's not what he was saying. He was saying, there's no vacancy. When there's a vacancy, I might be interested. Okay, so he seems to be in touch with reality. And the Bergen Record did publish my letter on Sunday explaining this point, that there's no removal process until we make a removal process.
Anybody haven't seen it, we could pass it around.
But basically, that's the point. Now, what arrangements has Ferriero made, in fact, in the real world, given that there's no removal process, even though he's under multiple counts of a federal indictment, and has been for months? Okay. He announced to Kay Nest, his vice chair, that she was going to take all the powers that the chairman exercises, and she was going to exercise them in his place. Okay? And he was going to be on a so-called leave of absence, a term that doesn't appear in the bylaws. Okay, this is what does appear in the bylaws, and everyone here should take a look at their copy of it. This is the bylaws. I have a copy because I used to be a member of this committee. Okay. The bylaws say that the chairman has all these powers, A through L. What are the powers of the vice chair? A, assist the chairman in the performance of his duties, and B, in the absence of the chair, which is the relevant phrase because he's now on leave of absence, preside at meetings. Notice, that's it. None of the other powers of the chair go to the vice chair, quote, in the absence of the chairman. You can all read this for yourselves. It's absolutely clear language. When Joseph Ferriero said to Kay Nest, you're going to exercise all my other powers, such as signing checks, dispersing the funds of the committee, hiring a new counsel to replace Dennis Ury, Paul Kaufman. You're going to have all these powers. He was saying, you will take upon yourself powers that are not yours under the bylaws, and which I have no right to give you. Now, in doing this, Joseph Ferriero was once again violating the bylaws, which you can all read for yourselves, and violating that provision of our New Jersey state law, which requires Ferriero to obey the bylaws. Okay? But he doesn't care about that because when we called the Reform Convention, he broke our bylaws and our state law back then, and no one called him on it. Once again now, he's violating the bylaws and the state law. Now, what happened after he made these illegal and improper arrangements? A meeting occurred on September 15th at which Congressman Rothman was present, and Senator Weinberg was present. And the meeting was, among other things, to discuss this idea of Ferriero's that Kay Nest, his vice chair, would be assuming all of these powers in violation of the bylaws. Senator Weinberg, when the topic came up, said, this is not proper, and I'm not going to give my support to this. Everyone else in the room was fine with it. They went right over Senator Weinberg's objections, and they, as a group, endorsed this idea. So they, at that point, and I'm including Congressman Rothman because he was in the room, became part of an improper arrangement whereby the leadership of the Democratic Committee was usurped and handed to Kay Nest, someone who has never been elected chair and who cannot properly exercise these powers.